What would you call these three objects on screen? Chances are not everyone you know would call them the same thing. Some people might say shopping cart while others would say buggy. Some people might say tennis shoe while others might call it a sneaker. Some people might use soft drink while others use soda. My name is Kimberly Harris, and today I'll be talking about speech variation as a result of geographical regions, specifically when it comes to the term that people use for the contraption that you use to carry your groceries around the grocery store. For the sake of this presentation's convenience, I'll be referring to it as a shopping cart. The prior research that inspired my own research was the Harvard Dialect Survey. It was an online questionnaire that ended in 2013 with 122 questions about vocabulary, grammar, and punctuation, and it helped gather data on nationwide language variation. It used maps to show the results of variation in each question, as can be seen on the screen. So I chose to do this study because there are a lot of people on my track team from different regions around the United States. We like to joke around and ask each other what we call different things because we know it'll be differently. So I wanted to see if I could find real solidified patterns if I were to put together a study in which I ask people those same types of questions. My research question was, how would geography lead to lexical differences in the terms people use to describe the same thing? This will guide my research and help me find out not only if variation does exist depending on geographical region, but also how it does and why those patterns might exist in the first place. My hypothesis was that variation first will exist because of geographical regions. I guessed that the South would primarily use the term buggy, the Midwest would use shopping cart, and the North would also most often use shopping cart, but the most variation within the region would exist in the North. My linguistic variable for this study is the different terms people use to describe the same item. For example, the tennis shoe versus sneakers, soda versus pop, shopping cart versus buggy. But for this study, I'll be focusing solely on shopping cart. My social or deep independent variables are the three geographical regions of the United States, the North, the South, and the Midwest. The map on screen shows how I define these regions. The states outlined in red are what I consider the North. The states outlined in green are what I call the Midwest, and the states in blue are the South. The participants of my study include 5 people from each of the regions, 5 people from the North, 5 people from the Midwest, and 5 people from the South. I also handpicked each of the participants based on people that I know from each of these regions. This helped maintain control of sorting through survey results, and it also allowed me to pick people from different places within the region to get the most variation in a region. In order to survey my participants, I created a Google form questionnaire that asked 3 questions. The first question was, where were you born? This was kind of just an intro question, didn't really have to do with the data itself. The second question was, where were you raised? And this is how I will determine the geographical region that I consider each person to be from. The last question is, what is the word that you naturally use to describe the object you carry your groceries in as you go throughout the store? So reasoning for my methodology, I focused on one lexical term, shopping cart, and I also used a smaller participant group of only 15 participants. I did both of this in order to focus on one subject of variation that I could deeply research the background and reasons for, and to account for the scope and time in which the project is supposed to be completed. The image on screen shows the summary of my research findings. It says that 20% of people from the South say shopping cart, while 80% say buggy. 20% of people from the Midwest say cart, while 80% say shopping cart. And 40% of people from the North say shopping cart, 20% use cart, 20% use grocery cart, and the other 20 use the word trolley. This is just a written form of my findings. So in other words, 4 people from the South use buggy, while 1 person used shopping cart. The North had the most internal variation, with 2 people using shopping cart, 1 using cart, 1 using grocery cart, and 1 using trolley. In the Midwest, 4 people use shopping cart, while 1 person used the word cart. So does my data support my hypothesis, and the answer is yes. Variation does depend heavily on geographical region, and it was confirmed that most people from the south do use the word buggy. The northwest and north most often use the word shopping cart, and the most inner variation occurs in the northern region. The main reason for southern variation is the history of horses and buggies as a means to travel with supplies. The term buggy was applied to the later invention of the shopping cart because many people in the south thought it looked the same as a horse and buggy. The term also lasted up to this day because of southern conservatism and the need to maintain tradition in the south. The Industrial Revolution was the thing that caused the variation in the north. It led to an influx of immigrants in the north from all different regions that had different cultural and linguistic backgrounds. The Industrial Revolution created a huge melting pot for different cultures and linguistic backgrounds, and the effects of those are seen today with lots of people using different words to describe the same thing. The reason for variation in the Midwest was due to the later settlement of the West. By the time the West was settled, the standard English dialect was already established, and it was then adopted by Midwest settlements. So the reason the most widely used term shopping cart is also the most frequently used in the Midwest is because the Midwest has the most standard English dialect. The limitations for my study include the fact that I had a smaller sampling size with only 15 people, 5 people from each region. This could limit widespread variation or widespread patterns. And then I also used self-defined geographical boundaries, which a lot of people might disagree with. So if I were to do this in the future, I would find a more standardized boundary map that I could refer to. Lastly, I chose to use purposive sampling as I handpicked the participants to make sure that I had the right data, but it could also create unconscious biases based on who I chose. Areas for further research include fixing some of the limitations I mentioned beforehand. So first, I would increase the number of participants until I had at least 25 participants from each of the geographical regions. I would also ask more questions about different lexical terms that could create variation. For example, I would ask the terms from the first slide about tennis shoes versus sneakers, soda versus pop, and remote control versus masher, as some people would say. And lastly, I would find a more standardized boundary map that I could refer to and that wasn't just opinion-based. And then lastly, my references that led to my hypothesis, as I mentioned before, is the Harvard Dialect Survey, and on the screen you can see a picture of how the results were gathered after all the questions were asked, and a map was drawn out to see where that variation exists. So yeah, that's all for today. Thank you for listening.